This week on Lewis on the Law, I've got another great show for you. I have attorney Michael Waller in with me, and we're going to talk about the Georgia Appleseed Center for Law and Justice.
Welcome to Lewis on the Law.
You are listening to Lewis on the Law. My name is James Lewis, and I have yet another awesome show for you guys today. I have attorney Michael Waller in with me, and he is the Director of Projects for the Georgia Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. Michael, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on the show.
Actually, it is my pleasure. I love your organization, and I have always been under the impression that Georgia Appleseed was this huge embodiment, this huge nonprofit organization directing operations all over the state of Georgia, and maybe even you guys have national different offices, right?
That's right. We're part of a national network. So each of there's Appleseed centers in 17 states and Mexico, but we're all independent. But we work together on some issues.
Yeah. So I think I've gotten this impression that you guys are really large, but is that not a fact?
Well, we are large. In fact, we have a larger impact than you might suspect.
Oh, no, I actually suspect that you guys have a pretty large impact.
Based on our size, I should say. So that's kind of the lead. We have six permanent staff members. But I often hear that, and that's because one of the ways that we work is one of the ways that makes us unique, in fact, is that we rely on a very large pool of volunteer pro bono lawyers and other types of professionals. So when we take on a project, we're able to do a lot more work than you'd expect from six folks.
Yeah, because I actually this is a credit to your organization, but Georgia Appleseed actually impacted the way I went in law school. I actually was in the land use and environmental planning department of our law school, and a lady by the name of Shunta McBride came in and gave a presentation on what was called heirs property. And she worked with Georgia Appleseed and their heirs property project. And this was before there was an heirs property law center. And so that actually inspired my legal research and the way I went in my practice of law.
That's great.
So that's due to you guys.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. And heirs property, I know that's not what we're going to talk about today,
it's
but
not.
It's a fascinating, important social justice issue. And I'm glad that you were impacted by that.
Yeah.
And by us. So we have a large pool of amazing pro bono lawyers and law firms and some other professional firms like Ernst & Young and PwC. And without them, we couldn't have the impact that we do. So most of the credit goes to our volunteers, for sure.
Excellent. So why did you become involved, or why did you want to become involved with Georgia Appleseed?
Sure. Well, like a lot of folks, I'm really moved by the impact that a decent, fair education and home environment has on children, and those are two of the primary issues we work at Appleseed in this part of our history. But my personal story goes back a little farther. So I moved to Atlanta about 2 years ago from Washington D.C. I was a prosecutor with the Federal Trade Commission, prosecuting consumer cases, companies that ripped off consumers. But I had been a legal aid attorney here with Atlanta Legal Aid years before, and I'd always wanted to come back. It's a great place to work. It's a great place to live. But when you're going to take this kind of job, like, you've got to prepare for it, because and I want to, all the lawyers out there who want to do pro bono work or social justice work, and you got to think ahead and prepare, because it's just not a lot of money in it.
Yeah.
So it took a number of years for my wife and I to sort of figure things out and save some money and start networking, and I landed in a spectacular place.
Yeah, I do some pro bono work and some social justice work, but I have to limit it because I also have to keep paying clients coming in as a private attorney. So I understand exactly the limitations and some of the considerations you have to take when you're actually dedicating yourself to this type of work.
Yeah, it takes a lot of planning and care, and there are folks out there who are doing some really impressive work under a lot of personal stress. So if you see a legal services attorney, somebody from Legal Aid, Georgia Legal Services, Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation, make sure you say thank you.
Well, I've had all of those groups on this show, and along with the Heirs Property Law Center, Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers, and of course Atlanta Legal Aid several times. But I've had all those groups on this show, so I had to have you guys on for sure. Okay, so Georgia Appleseed, what exactly is Georgia Appleseed? What do they do?
Right, so you can think of us in a couple different ways, but one way that folks like to think of us is almost we're basically an equity organization. So what we're doing is
Okay, wait a minute. Slow it down. Whenever people start throwing out legal terms, I make them break it down, because our listeners, we get a lot of business listeners and just people who want to start businesses. And so equity, what do you mean by that?
Sure, that's a great question, because I guess as lawyers, we might mean something different than I actually intended.
Yeah, okay.
So I mean it more in the general sense of equity, like fairness.
Okay.
How people are treated, giving people access to the resources that they need. So primarily, we work on children's issues right now and keeping kids out of prison, actually. Keeping kids out of prison and in school and in safe homes. But the way that we do that is that we go out to communities, we talk with folks, listen to folks. They identify the issues where they need assistance and support. And then here's where the equity comes in. So we then bring to them all the power and force of this pro bono community. But instead of representing them on individual matters, which is what these legal services attorneys that you and I were just talking about do, we give them access to lawyers like a wealthy person or a corporation might. If a wealthy person or a corporation had a big systemic problem they need to deal with, they would hire a law firm to do analysis, research, provide guidance, that sort of thing. What we try to do is we bring those resources to the communities. So when the community identifies a problem, so let's say it's the lack of mental health services for children. You mentioned heirs property, so folks in rural communities who are, especially people of color, who are struggling with land rights and losing their land. We bring the law firms to them to form a solution, a potential law or policy solution usually. Oftentimes that takes the form of changing a law. But many times it's not. Many times it's working with local communities, local institutions to enact reforms on a very local level. And you and I think, are going to talk about some of those reforms, what we're working on now. But that can be in an individual school. So it's a wide range of stuff. It's an exciting organization because in some ways it functions a little bit like a think tank, a little bit like an innovation lab, and a little bit like a legal center. And so we're pretty nimble. We do a lot of very interesting work.
Okay, that is extremely interesting. So do you primarily serve the community or do you serve individuals also?
So we primarily serve the community with one exception. So we serve low-income Georgians, particularly Georgians of color. And the reason for that is because a lot of the issues that we look at are disproportionately impacting communities of color. So we serve those communities. And the way that we do that, like I said before, is we have this process of listening to them and talking with them, and letting them identify issues that they need help with. But there's one exception, and this is very exciting. We represent and recruit volunteer lawyers to represent children in foster care when they're facing expulsion or suspension from schools. And so when they're facing tribunals, we'll actually find and provide a lawyer for them. That program's a program we've been doing for a few years. It's limited to the Atlanta area, but we're hoping to expand that statewide.
Okay, so how exactly do you involve low-income people into your work?
That's a great conversation. It's one we're always trying to think more about and do a better job. So when your listeners hear this, they're going to say, "Man, you need to think of this other technique I've got in mind." And hopefully they'll contact us and tell us, because that's super critical to what we do. Right now, there's a variety of mechanisms that we use, because for us, like I said, it's critical that we are communicating with those communities and that we're serving them. If we aren't constantly in contact with them and talking with them, we're going to end up devising remedies, maybe some bright ideas, but they're probably just going to be bright ideas and serve us and not necessarily serve the community. We can talk about some examples of that and how that works. But the way that we do it is we do long-form interviews with people. So we just wrapped up a project where we interviewed over 100 people across the state, sat down with them, listened to them about behavioral health services for children. We've done a big project on race, law enforcement, and the law. We sat down with 180 people across the state. We send volunteers out. They sit with them. They sit with people and listen. We have a questionnaire for them to go through in place with them. That's one form. We also, of course, do focus groups and discussion groups. We have partner organizations. We don't claim to be a grassroots organization. Right? We have experts that we bring to the service of folks in the grassroots. So we have our partners who are grassroots. We engage with them, and youth and adults the same. And we also go out into the community and we do public engagement presentations. And those have a very particular Appleseed style. We'll usually come to share some knowledge that we have. So let's say about education law or something like that. But that meeting is also not just about us lecturing to folks. Always built into it is a listening session where we're gaining information from them for that, because that's critical to us. We try to make sure that those presentations are question-driven. In other words, the audience is asking the questions. And we also try to devise activities where audience members, participants are actually interacting with one another, because we see that as an opportunity to help build community there, because those folks are going to end up advocating for one another in the future.
That's incredible. So that brought up a lot of questions in my mind, and we're at the end of this segment, so we won't be able to get into it right now, but maybe we will when we get back. Can you give them some contact information for Georgia Appleseed? Can you give our listeners some contact information?
Absolutely. Let's go. Let's start with the website. So just go to georgiaappleseed.org. It's GAAppleseed.org. That's the easiest way to find our contact information. And you can always send me an email at mwaller, Michael Waller. So mwaller@GAAppleseed.org.
You're a brave person by giving your email out. You're listening to Lewis on the Law. My name is James Lewis, and I have attorney Michael Waller on with me from the Georgia Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. I got to get that branding right. We've got a lot more in store for you. When we get back, we're going to talk about children with learning and behavior challenges, and I want to also touch on that segment on what you spoke about race and law. It really interests me. You are listening to Lewis on the Law. My name is James Lewis, and I have an awesome show going for you. I have attorney Michael Waller on with me, and he's the director of projects for the Center for Law and Justice for the Georgia Appleseed, or the Georgia Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. I think that's the correct way. I got to get my branding right. Before we get back into our conversation, I want to let you guys know that this show is only designed to give you information to help you, maybe guide you in a process, let you know what resources are available for you, what issues you have to hold on to, whether or not you actually have some type of issue that you might need an attorney to help you with. This show is not meant to give you legal advice. If you have a serious legal issue, go ahead and contract with an attorney. You can find them through my website. I let each attorney that comes onto my show give contact information for them. So you can always go back to my shows. If you see an issue that you think might affect you, go ahead and contact the attorney that appeared on my show, or the legal organization that appeared on my show. And you can contact them directly. You can always drop me a line and I can help you find an attorney. If I can't help you with your legal issue, you can always contact me at jameslewislegal.com. You can email me at james@jameslewislegal.com. And you can give me a phone call at 404-610-0075. Okay, Michael, when we left off, a lot of what you were saying was incredibly fascinating, and I'm really fascinated about race and law enforcement. I mean, this feels like a huge social justice issue.
Yeah, it is a huge social justice issue, and it's a truth issue. I mean, it's something that we need to talk more about, better understand, and admit that much of how our state is organized and has been organized historically is around race and separating race and benefiting one race over the other. So it's an issue that's going to pervade everything we talk about today. And so at any point in the conversation where we need to sort of touch base about race, we should do that. We had a massive project in 2016. It's a fascinating project. It predates me. And I can't remember if I mentioned last segment, but I started in September, so I'm relatively new. So I still like to brag a lot. I think I still have legitimacy when I do that. This is an amazing, huge undertaking. And we interviewed about 180 people, regular citizens, people from the faith community, judges, lawyers, police officers, police chiefs across the state, sat down with them, interviewed them, and asked them about the relationship between race, law enforcement, and the law. And this was in the wake of Ferguson and some of the other horrific events that made national news. So I want to talk, I can tell you a little more about that, but first I think I need to provide just a little bit of context to explain what we're doing right now and sort of how that fits. We primarily focus our work right now on supporting children in home and at school. And that came out of what we've been doing for the last 10 years or so, which is trying to protect kids from and keep them from entering the criminal justice system. And one of the ways that we realized one of the most important ways that we could help dismantle the school to prison pipeline was by supporting them in school. Because there was a direct relationship between school discipline, kicking kids out of school, and basically pushing them into the school to prison pipeline.
That's interesting, kind of proactively affecting the community.
Well, that's right. So our approach, right, is to go to the community, ask what the issues are, and with them study the problem and look at it from a systemic perspective. So we don't represent individual folks, with the one exception, the children in foster care that I mentioned earlier. So we look at the systemic issues, and when you do that, you have to go back to causes, and you go back as far as you can. But we're also really pragmatic. Like we want to fight for reforms, changes that are achievable in Georgia now, right? So that constrains us. Like, we have to try to find things that we can practically accomplish. And what we realized was we could make an impact on school discipline. We could make an impact in schools. And schools are where kids spend almost half their time, right? The rest of the time is at home. And you and I are going to talk about that too. But a lot of our programming is in protecting children at home and healthy housing. This year, you've already talked to some folks this year about one of our biggest victories, which was HB 346, which is a new law, probably the most important tenant rights law since the 1970s in Georgia.
Yeah, and I actually have my first client dealing with the issue, so I'm about to get into it.
Yeah, and I can't wait to hear about your experience.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I'm going to talk about my client here on air
well,
today.
maybe between the two of us.
Yeah, we'll wait till that plays out a little bit. Yeah.
Always looking for feedback on our project, so we can talk about that offline.
Well, I think it's extremely needed. I mean, in my situation, I'm dealing with someone who's a little bit elderly and needs the protection. So that you've offered them protection for they're basically standing up on their rights and then being selected and harassed and maybe discriminated against because of the fact that they stood up and said something.
That's exactly right. And you can have every law you want protecting folks, but if they can be retaliated against for exercising those rights, they're probably not going to. You've got to protect
and it cowers everyone else. I mean, and once again, I don't want to get too much into it, but she's describing how it's affecting, how they're targeting her is affecting the rest of the population.
Yeah, and we should be clear. We're talking about here is a landlord who isn't living up to the legal obligations they already have to provide safe, sanitary living conditions. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about imposing new requirements on landlords.
Yeah,
this is just merely allowing people.
They just have to meet their legal standards.
That's exactly right.
Exactly. Okay. So what other services do you guys offer? What other kind of work do you guys do?
So we're working, like I said, in those sort of two primary areas, school and the home. Where we focus is on a couple of things in the school. So we've got a big project now underway where we're supporting schools, Department of Education, parents, and caregivers, learning more about how to get behavioral health, mental health services for their kids in schools. So we've just completed the interviewing session of one of those big interviewing projects. So we've spoken to over 150 people across the state about school-based behavioral health. In other words, providing those mental health services for kids in school, how that can be achieved. And Georgia is poised to be a national leader on this. Georgia has,
oh my God, that is great. I love it. We're always behind the curve. I love the fact that we're poised to be a national leader on something.
Right. So let me give you, we'll balance this out. We were behind the curve on healthy housing issues. Okay. But when it comes to some school reforms, particularly school climate and school-based behavioral health, Georgia is moving ahead. We're going to be a national leader. We are a national leader already in some ways. And so I'm happy to talk about that because that is good news. We started this work about 10 years ago, like I said, and we quickly realized that not only did we need to have schools change the way, change their approach to discipline when it came to suspensions and expulsions, schools would have an easier time and if they adopted evidence-based approaches to school climate. In other words, how does that school feel? Does that school feel safe to kids? They feel supported. They feel like they can fail. They feel like they can make mistakes. Are you rewarding good behavior? And we started working with schools and the Department of Education to help schools adopt PBIS, which is positive behavioral supports. And that now has become, that's the number one evidence-based program in the country. And now 50% of Georgia schools have adopted that since then. 50%. Now, there's questions with how much fidelity, but 50%. So that's changed the lives of 50% of Georgia's school children and how they feel about their school. And research shows if you can provide a positive school climate, if you can provide a school that feels safe and secure to them, a place where they can learn and they can try and they can fail and it's okay, that will help kids that are suffering from trauma at home cope with that trauma. Those kids will have better outcomes. Before, they would have been condemned sometimes to a fate based on that trauma they were experiencing outside the home. And that might be, different types of abuse and neglect and other things. But that school is not going to solve the problems, but it's going to help them cope, gives them a chance.
Excellent. So exactly when do you think you'll see the impact of this work? I mean, are you already seeing it now, or do you expect this to be a progressive change, subtle progressive change that builds over time?
Both those things. We're seeing the impact right now. The school's discipline numbers, and you can go to to our website, or you can go to the Governor's Office of Student Achievement, and you can look at the data from school discipline. You can look at the number of kids over time who are being expelled or suspended from school. And let's take a step back, because when you expel a child from school, there's nowhere to go, right? So they're just basically on the street. And you can imagine what happens. People get into trouble, and they become victims also. They're exploited by criminal elements. There are populations that are more vulnerable than others. Black kids are more vulnerable. Kids in foster care are much more vulnerable. Those kids in foster care, 11% of them graduate from school, according to the state's own statistics in 2018.
Well, definitely with limited opportunities, and even if they have the mental blocks that may perceive themselves as having limited opportunities, that goes a long way to affecting what they think they can be or can do, and the opportunities that are available for them right now.
That's exactly right. And once they leave the school, and if they get entangled with the criminal justice system, then it's really hard to not be entangled.
Well, especially once you have a felony, it kind of follows you around for
that's right.
for huge portions of your life and limits what you can do.
We were a big part of rewriting the Juvenile Justice Code about when the new code was passed about 5 years ago, and we were a big part of that push, and we've been part of it since basically we were founded. But that was also an area where Georgia was a leader. Georgia stepped up and said, "Look, our criminal justice system isn't working properly." And over 8 years, the state's really changed its approach to criminal justice in a lot of fundamental ways. There's a lot of improvement to be made, and it did the same thing with juvenile justice. And because there's a realization that once you get entangled with the system, it's very difficult to get out of it. And when you take an individual,
I think that's accurate. I think
that's right,
accurate.
right?
Yeah.
The research shows that, and you're also putting that burden on the communities, because what happens when you have folks in your community that don't have access to jobs, don't have access to sort of a productive life? What happens to the community? So there's a big impact on the community too.
Excellent. Okay, we're at the end of this segment. Michael, will you give them some contact information for Georgia Appleseed once
Sure.
again?
Go to our website, Georgia Appleseed, so GAAppleseed.org, GAAppleseed.org, and you can always reach out to me directly, mwaller@GAAppleseed.org.
Excellent. You're listening to Lewis on the Law. This show comes to you each and every single week. I want to let you guys know that this show it not only airs Saturday mornings here in the Atlanta area, but this show streams nationally on every single large major national streaming platform that you can think of. I can only think of like 3. I say them: iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. I'm sure there are more, and eventually I'll probably have a little thing where I actually read out the ones that we're streaming on. But we are streaming nationally. We are also AI compatible. You can go to your AI device and say, "Hey, Alexa, play Lewis on the Law, episode 55 with attorney Michael Waller," and this show will come streaming out of your AI device. When we get back, I want to talk a little bit about the history and where Georgia Appleseed is headed. You are listening to Lewis on the Law. My name is James Lewis, and I'm your host this week and every week. And this show is designed to bring you information that may help you make an informed decision, may tell you if you actually have a legal issue, may help you select the type of attorney or the type of help you need to handle your legal issue. This show is not meant to be legal advice. Don't go by what you hear on this show. Sometimes you hear specific legal issues talked about. Don't use that as advice to handle your own legal issue. We are not encouraging that. If you have a serious legal issue, go ahead and contract with an attorney. You can always contact me at james@jameslewislegal.com. You can go to my website, jameslewislegal.com, and on my last page is a contact page. You can always hit me there. You can always give me a call at 404-610-0075. All my old shows are archived on my website. You can go to jameslewislegal.com, and any of my old shows, you can browse through them. I always give the attorneys or the organizations an opportunity to give you their contact information directly. So you can always contact them directly. If you need help, you can always contact me, and I will be glad to help you. I do this show because I want to help you, the listeners out there. I know that people who don't have enough information or access to justice can be deeply affected by our legal system. I know this intimately. When we and that ties right into what we were talking about, because a minute ago we were talking about race and law enforcement, and specifically here in America, people of color can be deeply affected by the legal system and sometimes by law enforcement. I mean, we see the headlines in the news. You spoke about Ferguson earlier. So what exactly is your program?
Right. So a couple of years ago, 2016, well, more than that, I guess, we published a report that was based on about 180 interviews with Georgians across the state, judges, lawyers, police, concerned citizens, folks in the faith community. And we produced a report, and that report outlined a number of pragmatic, achievable recommendations based on those conversations and legal analysis to support that. Again, that's our model. Our model is to hear from the community, respond to the community, and then provide the power of all of this sort of professional expertise and advice that come from our pro bono community to analyze those issues and suggest and analyze some potential reforms. So that report came out. I encourage folks to go to our website, gappleseed.org. Look at that report. That is a report about Georgians, about race and law enforcement and law, about Georgians by Georgians. So it is a homegrown. It was a homegrown effort. It's a tremendous report. Like I said, I can brag about it. I wasn't even with the organization at that point in time, so I'm just privileged to sort of sit in the seat of the previous director of projects who ran that. And some of the recommendations we made have actually come into play, but are come into being. But we made recommendations about standard operating procedures, changes there, use of force, accountability requirements, changing department demographics, so having a more diverse police force, training. How charging decisions were made when police officers were involved in a shooting or committed a crime. So take a look at that report. I think it's fascinating. It ties into our current work too, and let me tell you how it informs that. So I mentioned before that we work with schools. We also help schools partner with local juvenile courts. So there's a great partnership here in Fulton County called the Pathways Committee. It's led by Judge Renata Turner, and it brings a juvenile judge. Juvenile court judge. It brings together different stakeholders who, in school climate and truancy, and beyond that, just sort of the criminalization of youth and how youth are treated by the discipline system in the schools and the police system and then the courts. So as part of that process, we support that group, and we're working with law enforcement officers there to better understand sort of how they interact, the effective interactions on students. Although I should say that Atlanta Public Schools and the Fulton County Public Schools Police are super receptive and on board with this and trying really hard to always improve their service. But one of the specific ways this has manifested itself in that partnership is there's a memorandum of understanding between those police departments, the school districts, and the courts about how the police should respond to minor infractions by students. And you'll hear in some schools where there's kind of a zero tolerance policy and the police get involved, the kids are arrested, and then of course they're referred to juvenile court. That doesn't have to be the way it is. It's not necessarily the right way. Do you think
that adversely, it makes sense that would adversely impact the students if that was the reaction?
Well, that's exactly right. So again, there are issues of safety that need to be handled by police. No one's disagreeing with that. But a lot of the things that people got away with when we were younger are no longer tolerated at all. And they lead to criminalization and entanglement with the criminal justice system. And again, that has huge life impacts on kids. It disproportionately affects kids of color and poor kids. And so it's something that, for that fact alone, of that disproportionate impact, we should be studying and looking at and concerned about, because it's repeating some historical patterns that really should trouble us. But we're supporting the SROs, school resource officers here, by helping them understand that MOU, helping to develop materials they can use to educate their officers. And we're taking that to other parts of the state too. And we help school districts understand alternative discipline techniques, using restorative practices, using PBIS, school climate reforms in order to reduce the amount of disciplinary incidents. You and I didn't talk about that, but schools can make some minor changes in the sense of cost to their school climate, and that will reduce discipline incidents overall, which improves the lives of all the students there.
Mm-hmm.
Schools can look for funding to provide behavioral health services for students, and that improves the lives of all the students there. And that's what you may have heard, what some people call a cut curb effect.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what is a cut curb effect?
This is fascinating,
Okay.
and I came across this, stumbled across this. I didn't come up with it, of course, and it's really helps me think about equity issues, like fairness issues.
Yeah.
And not that long ago, the cut curbs, those things in the curves, the cut out of the curb that makes a ramp down to the street from the curb.
Got it. Mm-hmm.
So not that long ago, those were very rare, non-existent. Well, that was a real problem for people with disabilities, of course. Right? So apparently, there were these disability advocates and people who were not able-bodied allies and folks with disabilities who would go out in the night and sort of in these slow-moving, like guerrilla concrete action, pouring concrete. I don't know how to describe it. And pouring ramps in the middle of the night. And they were threatened by cities for they were vandalizing the streets and all that.
But they're just trying to make things better.
That's exactly right. And after a while, society sort of caught up, and we said, no, that's right. We need to make sure folks have access, and we started cutting the curbs. Well, when they started doing that, it turns out everyone likes a cut curb. We all prefer to have that little ramp, whether you're dragging luggage or pushing a catering cart or just stepping off the curb. So cut curb effects are those things that you do in order to make life more equitable. Right, for other people, but they end up benefiting all of us. And those are the kinds of solutions that we're looking for at Georgia Appleseed. Those things that benefit everybody. Those are the practical solutions that we can get a lot of support for, we can move on, and can change everybody's lives.
I love that. And there might even be an argument made that things that truly benefit society may benefit everyone. If it benefits a disadvantaged population of society just by that effect, it benefits all of us. And I love that, the cut curb effect. I mean, I consider myself a socially aware attorney and an attorney who fights for social justice. So I love that idea. It's
a great shorthand. And if you orient yourself towards equity and you orient yourself towards lifting up folks, it's going to improve your life and everyone else's too.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about the history of Georgia Appleseed. Where is Georgia Appleseed headed? Is it more towards state and legislative actions?
So we're going to continue to be involved on the state level. We have close relationships with some of our state agencies, for example, the Department of Education. We're going to maintain those relationships. And we're well known for building coalitions. We really believe in the power of coalitions. But we also recognize the importance of local action. We've been working with the community in Savannah, the Cuyler-Brownsville neighborhood, for the last couple of years, and learning from them about how to facilitate local action. As I mentioned before, we don't pretend to be a grassroots organization. So what we want to do is go and provide resources for communities to help them organize around issues and identify issues. So we're starting a big project right now to take our healthy housing work down to local communities across the state and help them develop local action groups that will identify reforms that they can achieve around housing conditions, particularly housing code enforcement, and then act on those plans. We've also partnered with the Carter Center and Voices for Georgia's Children to go around the state and learn and listen to people and share information about behavioral health services for children in schools.
That is excellent stuff. Can you give us some contact information for Georgia Appleseed?
Sure. Please come to our website, gaappleseed.org. That's gaappleseed.org.
You're listening to Lewis on the Law. My name is James Lewis, and this show comes to you each and every single week to provide you with legal information. Remember, if you have a serious legal issue, this show is not meant to give you legal advice. Go ahead and contract with an attorney. You can always get in touch with me at jameslewislegal.com. You can email me at james@jameslewislegal.com, or you can give me a call at 404-610-0075. When we get back, we're going to talk a little bit about children with learning and behavior challenges, and we're going to talk some more about the prison pipeline. You are listening to Lewis on the Law. My name is James Lewis, and I have an awesome show going for you guys today. I have attorney Michael Waller on with me, and he is the Director of Projects for the Georgia Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. I want to remind you guys, this show not only airs on Saturday mornings at 9 a.m., but we also stream nationally on every large national streaming platform, Google Play, iTunes, Spotify, you name it, we're streaming nationally. Michael, when we left off, we were talking about, or I wanted to ask you about children with learning and behavioral challenges. What type of supports do you guys offer for people in that, or children in that situation?
Sure. Right now I mentioned before, we have a project, Bridges to Behavioral Wellness, and that's one of these large study interviewing projects I mentioned. But also we are reaching out to the community through community engagement events, primarily right now in Fulton County, although we have done some across the state in different places, Dougherty County and Albany, Athens, Savannah. And we're sharing with caregivers, parents, advocates, other folks, what we've learned about education law and the rights that kids have at school and the available services for them when they have behavior and learning challenges. And that's important to us because if you look at the research, what we're learning is that behavior is communication. Mm-hmm. So while we might have traditionally labeled a kid as just acting out or being bad, we now know that oftentimes they're trying to communicate something.
Excellent.
When
I love
they do
that. Behavior is communication.
That's right. And so the Department of Education has embarked on a project to train teachers across the state about mental health awareness, and it's catching on. But there's a lot of work to be done. So we recognize that as an issue. We partner with the Carter Center, Voices for Georgia's Children, who are already doing a lot of work in this area. And one of the things that we recognized was an issue was how to get information effectively out to people about not only the impact of behavioral health challenges on learning and behavior, but also what resources are there and how to access them. We approached it from a slightly different perspective in terms of accessibility. We decided that we would try to write a guide for folks who read at 60 words a minute or less.
Okay.
And that
seems difficult.
It is. And I encourage everyone to take a minute, time yourself, set a clock, try to read a little paragraph at 1 word a second. And you'd be amazed at how difficult comprehension is.
Have you tried this yourself?
I have, absolutely. In fact, this came out of my experience with the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC worked with a group called the Center for Applied Linguistics to build a website called consumer.gov. It's an amazing website, still out there. It's very popular, it's very effective, and it teaches people about basic consumer protection issues. Everything from how to buy a prepaid phone card to build a budget to how to shop for used cars. And the approach they took was writing these documents in a very disciplined way for folks who read at this speed. Either because they read at that speed or because English is a second language, whatever the reason is. And they spent a lot of time thinking about formatting and what makes a document easy to read and comprehend. It's a very difficult project, tremendous success. And what they learned in the end, what happened in the end was one of these cut curb effects that we talked about in the last segment. In the end, everyone preferred this style of writing. Everyone learned quickly. So for folks who read quickly, they just absorb the page. But it provided a scaffolding for more detailed information later on. So at Georgia Appleseed, we decided to attempt to do that ourselves and follow that lead. And so we just recently released last week our first set of help guides based on this method. And they're help guides for caregivers, primarily parents and other caregivers, with children with behavior and learning challenges. So everything from just some learning impairments to behavior challenges at school. Kids are acting out either because they have a disability or because they've suffered some trauma or just because they're trying to process some event that's happened at home. So those are available on our website. I encourage everyone to go check those out. One of the other services that we provide in this area and is with foster children.
Yeah, I think that's pretty important. I mean, it seems like it would be. It seems like foster children would have a lot of behavioral issues.
That's right. You mentioned the school to prison pipeline. We want to talk about that. And foster children in foster care are at a much higher risk, disproportionate risk of not graduating and entering the criminal justice system. So nationally, graduation rates, high school graduation rates are abysmal for foster children. They're at 30%. But in the state of Georgia in 2018, the state reported that for our kids in foster care, it's 11% graduation rate.
That is horrible.
Right. And you can imagine that the rate of graduating from a 4-year college is much, much lower. Nationally, I think it's about 2.5%. So the state of Georgia and the feds are doing some things to try to change that and turn that around. And DFACS is working hard to make a difference there for sure. But we're trying to do our part as well. We recognize this is a particularly vulnerable population. And again, the emphasis here is to keep these children in a safe environment in school.
It seems like the kids in foster care wouldn't have access to the resources that they would need to actually get into higher education.
Yeah, that's always a challenge. And there are some state programs to try to make that easier for them, give them tuition. The work that we're doing is to provide two things. We're looking at the issue from a policy perspective and identifying policy reforms. But we also provide direct representation to children in foster care when they're facing expulsion or long-term suspension at a tribunal. So we have volunteer lawyers who represent these children in those disciplinary hearings in an effort to educate the school about what's going on, make sure the kids' rights are being protected, and then ultimately to keep those kids in a safe school environment. And let me give you an example of what we're dealing with.
Can I ask you how you identify those children?
Sure. So we train DFACS caseworkers to reach out to us. And then that issue of notice, how they know about these tribunals, is also one of those policy issues we talked about. So for the wonks out there, we could talk in detail about who gets notice and who's entitled to notice for the lawyers in the audience. But let me tell you a quick story about these kids.
Okay.
So we represented a child a few months ago before a disciplinary tribunal. She was looking at a year-long suspension. And she was 11, same age as my daughter. It's like funny, quirky kid.
That is
great.
Horrible at 11 years old to face a year-long suspension.
Yep. And she was staring down the barrel of a long time out of school, which wasn't going to be good for her. But let me tell you about her background and what she did. So she was in foster care. She'd been there for about 2 years, and she was removed from her home due to physical abuse. And prior to that, she'd been sexually abused. So she's in foster care for 2 years. So over 2 years, she was moved 5 different times, 5 different homes. So just think about that for a second. If you move 5 times in 2 years, how you would feel. And then she also was.
I would feel bad if I just moved. 5 times in 5 years.
Right, and this was involuntary, right? She didn't have a choice here. So
and
then,
especially since she's actually subject to someone else and she's still a child, a minor.
That's right. And she was in 9 different schools.
That's incredible.
So what she was in trouble for was she was acting out. She was using some inappropriate language at school, over-sexualized language, and she was using some racial epithets. It wasn't that she was not doing any harm. What she was doing was serious and needed to be addressed. But the school's solution, because they were trying to deal with her, was, well, we need her out of the school.
Once again, was she a minority? Was she a person of color?
Yeah, she was a minority. Okay. That's right. So you can imagine, of course she was acting out. Of course she was using over-sexualized language. She was trying to process what she'd been through. She was 11. Well, the school system didn't even realize she was a foster kid until we showed up. Right? And so that was news to them. And so we were able to negotiate with the school attorney and get her into alternative school for just a semester. But she was then moved again to a different school and different placement after that. So you look at the challenges these kids are facing as they're trying to process what's happened to them. They need support. They need people standing there by them. And so Appleseed is one of those organizations that does that. And there are a lot of others, too, in the state committed to supporting foster kids.
Yeah, it's incredible because when you talk about a child moving that much, I mean, obviously the question is stability there.
That's right. And developing relationships. So I was at a meeting yesterday that was held by Voices for Georgia's Children, and they had some children that were formerly in foster care talking about their experience. And one of the things the kids talked about was, you don't have anyone to trust. You're moving from, maybe a well-meaning foster parent to another well-meaning foster parent facility. But again, you don't have those relationships that most of us rely on to ask questions, to learn from, to learn how to be, to learn what it's like to sort of move around the world, what's normal, what's not. And these kids often don't have that opportunity. They need champions.
Yeah, so is that just one of the challenges? Are there more challenges in dealing with kids in the foster care system?
Oh, they run the gamut. So those children, they need our support. They need lots of support. And DFACS is, of course, trying to provide that the best they can with limited resources. Absolutely. So, the DFACS's director is Tom Rollins. He always says, extend some grace to DFACS caseworkers because it's a tough job, and that's for sure.
They need a little grace.
They do. They need a little grace. Absolutely.
Now, do you see this your involvement in the school? Do you see discipline as something that can really be changed that will affect kids, especially if they're foster care children, especially if they're kids with behavioral issues? Do you think the type of discipline the schools actually engage?
Absolutely, that's critical. And again, that's why 50% of Georgia schools have begun to move in that direction, realizing that rewarding good behavior, setting expectations for kids, making those clear, reduces all of their disciplinary problems and makes it a better school for everybody. So for us, you asked about where we're headed in the future. So for us, the direction for us is to continue doing this type of work, continue supporting local communities and the state, continuing to push good legislation and draft legislation, as in the case of HB 346,
And we didn't even touch on that.
Right,
that
right.
is great legislation.
But it's also, again, to engage even deeper into the communities, to listen to the communities and support them. These ideas, these reforms, they're the folks who know. They're the folks living the experience, and you got to listen to them. So the youth and the adults, not just the experts, but the people actually living out the issues on a day-to-day basis. They're the ones who know what the problems are, and they have great ideas about solutions too.
Excellent, Michael. You have been an awesome guest, filled with wonderful information. Can you give our listeners some contact information for Georgia Appleseed once again?
Sure. Please come to our website, gaappleseed.org. It's gaappleseed.org.
You're listening to Lewis on the Law. My name is James Lewis, and I'd like to thank Michael Waller for being on with me. And I also want to thank the guys that make this happen, make the magic happen. The Cooler, Mr. AC, Anthony Cook over there making the video happen, and Mr. Sam Davis, the soothsayer of sound, pushing all the knobs and buttons. I'll see you guys next week.